Hello and welcome to our second keynote of this unusually substantive afternoon. I'm Stephen Haswell-Todd. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Zerilli. Linda is Charles E. Merriam Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where she is also Faculty Director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
6 years. It was great. Sorry,
her work is characterized by a truly impressive breadth of topics. She's published on thinkers from Machiavelli and Rousseau through Wittgenstein and Wittig, to mention only a few. And likewise, I have to make a selection from a long list of publications. The two I would like to mention have both already come up multiple times in the course of the afternoon. 2005's Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom is, I think it's fair to say, a classic that has had a great impact on me, and I'm sure many others in the room. And 2016's A Democratic Theory of Judgment will surely be a landmark in the literature on judgment, which is right now expanding in very exciting ways. So it's great to have her here, and I hope you'll now join me in welcoming Linda Zerilli.
Thank you, and sorry for interrupting. You're really not supposed to do that. And I apologize for keeping my coat on here, but I can't, it's chilly and, I'll probably get warmed up when I talk. Thank you, Roger, very much, and Tina for all of the, logistics and everything. It's delightful to be here at Bard. I've actually had a couple of graduate students who have profited from the Hannah Arendt Center, and I know they've always had just a really a great experience here, and I myself had never been here, so thank you for the invitation. Okay, so, yeah, sure thing. Am I speaking in it now? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sounds like a Verizon ad. Okay, so I took the homework assignment seriously, which was, basically the theme of the conference. So the question of, is the private political? This is, of course, a favorite question of any feminist, and we're going at it through Hannah Arendt today, which is fine with me. Now, the short answer to that, from an Arendtian and from my feminist perspective, would be no. However, I'm not going to give you just the short answer. So to treat the political or the private as always political, I think really risks occluding the different ways in which the private can be politicized. These are both good and bad, that's come up today, and equally important, the different ways in which feminists think about politics. It also risks falsely unifying plural conceptions of what is private and how it relates to political practice. So far from providing a single definition on which all feminists can agree, what counts as political or public and what private is itself a matter of some feminist contention and debate. However, they may coalesce on the need to redefine politics, to make visible that which has remained largely hidden in traditional masculinist conceptions of the public-private divide, feminists diverge widely in their understanding of what it would mean to politicize the private realm, and this turns in no small part in how they think about politics. Now, Hannah Arendt, as those of you here at this center will know, would surely answer no to the question of whether the private is political as well. But her reasons can be easily, I think, misunderstood. At times, it can seem as if Arendt's return to Greek and Roman thought to answer a question like this is an exercise in building walls between fundamental concepts such as public and private, to say nothing of the social. I personally find her ostensibly philological exercises, they are also deeply idiosyncratic, at definition, refreshing in these muddled times. But it seems really important, and this may be a point that's obvious to most of you, but it just has been occurring to me a lot lately that people have a tendency to almost read Arendt as if she were an analytic philosopher. Like, she is producing definitions, and these definitions are then going to be used to construct some ideal theory or to rule in or out, you know, certain kinds of things or activities, or what's going to count as X. That's what analytic philosophy does. That's why we're happy we have Hannah Arendt, right? So we have something else. Rather, she's really trying to help us and her readers to think politically. Her work, as she says, does not try to tell us what to think, but how to think, and it really is about exercises in political thinking. Now, perhaps this tendency to read her as if she were an analytic philosopher, regardless now of whether one has professional knowledge of such a thing, that has led so many feminists, with some important exceptions, to be quite hostile to what they see as Arendt's refusal to consider private issues of the body, the household, and the gender division of labor within it as political. In my view, this is a real misunderstanding of what Arendt means when she says, not that she ever does say, by the way, that the private is not political. I mean, she never actually says that. But I also think that is a misunderstanding of what feminists mean, or at least what they might mean, when they say that the private or the personal is political. So let me start here with feminism. So we all know the slogan of second wave feminism, the personal is political, or as Roger reminded us this morning, also the private is public. Typically taken to capture a feminist consensus about what politics is, this rallying cry seemed to state that what has been heretofore considered a private issue is by definition a public matter. Okay, so housework, sexuality, reproduction, childcare, etc., are all to be redefined as intrinsically political activities deserving of our collective concern. When stated in such broad terms, the understanding of this core claim of second wave feminism is really unobjectionable, but actually it harbors a number of problems. In the process of writing an entry on politics for the Oxford Handbook of Political Theory, I got into trying to figure out, well, okay, so where did this slogan actually come from, and the rest, how was it actually coined? And since I grew up with second wave feminism, it was something I actually once knew but had forgotten, which speaks not only to the state of my memory, but also how one can lose track of the political origin of political concepts. Right? I mean, that's really what I see Arendt's exercises in political thought about. They're really trying to get back to the original political origin of our political concepts, which have been so philosophically inflected that we've totally lost track of their political character. So, I know Drusilla's going to know this, and some others in the room, and Morris certainly, and others, that's not an age-out thing, you know. So this slogan was attributed to the New York radical feminist Carol Hanisch in an essay of the same title, which was called "The Personal is Political." And this was published in a volume which, I mean, maybe you folks have or other people have. It was called Radical Feminism. And it's a really bright yellow color, and it was cover, and it was published on like really cheap paper. I mean, I still have my copy, but I don't know if it's going to last much longer. In any case, the main reason for the thematization of the personal as political is that a lot of second wave feminists were being criticized, particularly by the New Left, for engaging in consciousness raising as a form of therapy, right? Sort of like, now they don't have Tupperware parties anymore, now they have, they're going to have this form of therapy, or the kind of proverbial feminist complaint or female complaint. So the notion of the personal as the political was an attempt to refuse all of these psychologizing explanations, especially as they did call into question the very need for the creation of feminist organizations independently of the New Left. Now, I mean, a lot of what these early feminists, particularly radical feminists, were arguing was simply that, you could not talk about an anonymous capitalist system. You had to also talk about individuals who were playing a certain kind of role. So men who were actually carrying out, so to speak, as they called it at the time, the patriarchy. Now, in a way, we can say, well, all right, so did they mean at that time that the personal just is by definition political? And I guess I want to say about that, in a way, who cares what they actually meant? I mean, we're never going to really get into their heads. The question is, what does it mean to go back and reread slogans like that and deploy slogans like that today? And what are we actually doing when we use a slogan like the personal is political? And what we're doing if we follow someone like Hannah Arendt, not someone like Hannah Arendt, if we follow Hannah Arendt, is we're saying that there are activities that are not actually by definition political, right? There's no substance in housework that makes it political, but it becomes political when it becomes an object of feminist, protest and debate, right? So that is to say, what we're really interested here, and this is what Arendt calls our attention to, is a process of politicization. That's really the key thing that I think she's really pointing to, and this is once again something that can be so easily forgotten when we get into the kind of walled city reading of Arendt, or analytic philosophy reading of Arendt. She's trying to get us to see the way in which activities, things that we do, or objects, they don't have a substance. Even, as she puts it, man himself. She quarrels with the Aristotelian notion of man as a political animal. She says there's nothing political about man as a human being, right? There's nothing in human nature that makes us political beings. So politics is for her always a process and always an activity. Now, really, when we look back on this, once again, this notion of the personal as political, what we're trying to figure out is how did these, what became slogans, become really tropes for organizing swaths of human experience, right? And I have, in previous work, I've talked about this in terms of the work of Cornelius Castoriadis, forms and figures of the newly thinkable. That is to say that a notion like the sexual is political, reproductive justice is political, housework is political. These become forms of the newly thinkable. Sexual harassment, political, just the concept of sexual harassment, which of course did not exist until I think it was 1974, is that right? Yeah, around 1974. Those are all concepts of the newly thinkable in the sense that they become a way of figuring experience and giving it a possibility of articulation. And that articulation is absolutely the difference between what Leclos and Mouffe, Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Leclos, call the difference between subordination and oppression. And I really think this is very similar to Hannah Arendt's argument here. According to Leclos and Mouffe, of course there have been relations of subordination throughout time. So, you could say, well, the personal was always political because there were always relations of subordination. They say, but what turns a relation of subordination into a relation of oppression? Which is to say, what's the point at which a relation of subordination, be it of a man and his wife, or of an employer and an employee, and the list goes on, at what point does that relation, is it seen as a relation not just of subordination, but of oppression, which is to say, political and open to change? Right? And that's really, I think, the main point that Arendt is also trying to get us to see, is that there's nothing intrinsically political about relations of subordination. They're there. And this brings me to the second point, which is the difference between Arendt and someone like Foucault. Right? As we know, Arendt is clearly very different. I mean, she agrees with Foucault on the critique of sovereignty. Power does not come from above, okay? But power for her is also not just everywhere. And she has a way of talking about power, once again, very idiosyncratic, which involves action in concert, which is, it's not because Hannah Arendt isn't aware that there are relations of power in the Foucauldian sense. Of course there are. But the real issue is for her, how is it that those relations of power are come to be politicized? So she's neither Carl Schmitt nor Foucault. I mean, she doesn't think power just operates from above, but she's also asking the question of how is it that these power relations, if you want to use the ordinary language that we use, come to be politicized. Okay. Now I want to get to what I think is a much more complicated topic in talking about Arendt, which is the body. I've defended Arendt in the past against feminist accusations of holding a wholly androcentric view on the body, especially in context of debates around sexual difference. So I'm not going to go into those arguments now. Instead, what I want to do is draw out what I consider to be an Arendtian approach to the topic of the body in feminism. And here I'm going to take another example that I became much more aware of when I was writing this entry for the feminist conception of politics for the Oxford Handbook. And that is the second wave classic, Our Bodies, Ourselves. I mean, most people probably know this book. It was published originally by the Boston Women's Collective in 1973. It went on in 7 editions to sell 4 million copies. I'm going to quote Kathy Davis on this. The OBS, as it was called, was a lively and accessible manual on women's bodies and health. It was full of personal experience and contained useful information on issues ranging from masturbation, how to do it, to birth control, which methods were available and how to use them, to vaginal infections, pregnancy, and nursing. It combined a scathing critique of patriarchal medicine and the medicalization of women's bodies with an analysis of the political economies of the health and pharmaceutical industries. But above all, OBS validated women's embodied experiences as a resource for challenging medical dogmas about women's bodies, and consequently as a strategy for personal and collective empowerment. And what makes OBOS, Our Bodies, Ourselves, of interest, I think, to the discussion today, is not only how the text was originally written. It was originally written as a series of discussion papers for meetings, public protests, collective local action, but also how it was taken up by feminists worldwide as a political rallying point for articulating differences and commonalities, which I take to be the definition in the loose sense of Arendtian public space. It was translated into multiple languages, including French, German, Italian, Spanish, Hebrew, Arabic, etc., etc., etc. And the book's most remarkable feature, writes Davis, is its ability to speak to a wide variety of women at different times and in disparate circumstances and social and cultural and political contexts. Now, would Arendt have dismissed as trivial the issues raised by the collective? Probably. But regardless of how we answer that question, what remains is the creation of what she called an interest. This was already brought up this morning. The in-between composed of tangible and intangible relations between people and things that arises when we engage in action in concert. What Arendt opposed was in bringing the body into what Arendt opposed about bringing the body into politics was its instantiation as necessity. Now, I know there may be people in this room, and I've had this quarrel with other folks before, that Arendt's very definition of the body is that it is the embodiment of necessity, if you like, right? And maybe we do need to read Arendt against Arendt here, so to speak. I think we almost always need to read Arendt against Arendt. You know, as a feminist, I know I often do have to read her against herself. But I still think that whether she thought of the body as itself the instantiation of necessity, or whether she thought that when it was brought into politics, it instantiated necessity, nevertheless, that was her worry. And so I guess the challenge would be, for those of you in the room or for others, to say why maybe do feminists want to affirm necessity? Like, is it something we would actually want to affirm as not being in any way troubling for feminist and democratic politics? You know, I mean, Arendt is really trying to get at the ways in which we are driven into a kind of instrumentalist logic and a form of means ends thinking. And that's what I'm going to get to now. Okay, so thus far, with the exception of this last point, I've mostly stressed the ways in which there might be connections between Arendt and feminism. But there are also some very, I think, very strong points of friction, and these can actually be highly problematic. So let me begin with another theme of this conference, which is the theme of natality. We talked about that this morning. And the female body's capacity to give birth and birth as such has been heralded by many feminists, and I don't just mean the old cultural feminists who nobody wants to read anymore, not that I agree with that dismissal, but also by new materialists as well. For the latter group, the body certainly, but also the body marked by sex gender, is a powerful reminder of our finitude and the last frontier between us and increasingly genomic dystopia. On this futuristic, yet somehow increasingly normalized terrain, we're not even going to have the strange solace of Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, right? Where you have a group of women who have been designated as the breeders for a superior class. I just read in the New York Times this is going to be made into a series starring, Elizabeth Moss from Mad Men. I guess there's a weird logic to that. But in any case, instead what we're actually being promised with is something that dispenses with natural birthing capacities altogether and institutes with it various forms of sex and ability selection, not to mention genius traits, or maybe if you're on a tight budget, just blue eyes and blonde hair. So there have been many feminist critiques of this development, especially as it's taken early shape in sex-selective and ability-selective fertility procedures, not to mention abortions. But this is really difficult terrain. There's always the risk of reifying the natural, and with it a highly fraught, real and symbolic connection between women and nature. That's why I mean, Ava's presentation this morning, I think, was very important in trying to, how can we think about something like birth, right, in non-naturalistic terms, but in Arendtian terms, really. That's really important because the tendency to think about birth is always to fall back into a notion of the natural. These days, when one feels pressure to give either a thumbs up or a thumbs down to so many complex social and political issues, it's really tempting to develop some sort of thought template that could be applied to each and every case involving the manipulation of nature and the body. Apart from the fact that there probably never was a time when humans did not manipulate nature and the body, this solution is clearly not what Arendt had in mind when she spoke of exercises in political thought. And it's here, I think, that Arendt's thought on natality can be of some use to us. Depending on which text you read, and this is sort of the points I was trying to make this morning, these thoughts can seem to be consistent or, to my mind, contradictory. But maybe I don't think they're contradictory anymore. Anyways, I just think they're different. When she is writing about Augustine on natality, to remind the philosopher in each of us that we are made of flesh and blood and actually still live on the planet Earth and are not just minds housed in bodies or skepticism's brain in a vat, Arendt tends to speak of the biological fact that every day someone new is born, and with that birth comes into the world a being, the wide-ranging effects of whose actions cannot be predicted. And there are also times when writing about men in dark times that Arendt will remind herself and her readers that even the most efficient logical thinking, the murderous alphabet of totalitarianism, as she called it, cannot preempt what has not yet come into being. Such passages are compelling in their own way, but for me, they have always rung a bit hollow. Offered perhaps as consolation of a sort, they pale in comparison to Arendt's deeply grim, if not absolutely devastating portrayal of totalitarianism and mass society generally, and even to the ferocious intellectual powers of the professional philosophers who have enlisted those powers in affirming the inevitability of necessity and denying contingency and freedom in the realm of human affairs. Consequently, I choose to emphasize those passages of text in which Arendt speaks of natality as something more like an activity in which we are engaged when we act politically. In other words, natality is not a feature of the human being as a biological or even a social being. And it is not an expression of our nature as Aristotle's political animals. Natality is simply that which happens when we act politically. We give birth, so to speak, to something new. Now, it's crucial to recall here that giving birth to something new is not a creation on our part. It's not something we can intentionally bring about or control. It's simply what comes about through action in concert. Why does this qualification matter? Well, for one thing, it reminds us that we simply cannot know what we do when we act in Arendt's sense, where knowing means being in some way not only cognizant of, but in control of all possible outcomes. Furthermore, it's here that Arendt offers significant resources for contemporary feminists trying to resist or at a minimum shape the technologies that are being developed to give us, or so they purport, more control over who we are, what we can become, and who we can bring into the world. And if one is looking for natality as a kind of biological happening in Arendt's work, well, I think anyone who's had children, I'm not one of them, knows that the most perfect infant can turn into the most perfect monster. I mean, even biological birth, there is no control, I mean, at all. It is not only illusory, but downright delusional to think that we can gain the kind of control over our mortal bodies in the way that the future of genomics is being sold to us. You know, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I have actually asked students in my classes to raise their hands of how many of you have bought your own personal version of 23andMe, right? And it's kind of amazing. I mean, actually, how popular this stuff has become, because it's really cheap now. I mean, that version of it is very cheap. It's all, what?
What is it?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's, okay. Good, you would not have raised your hand. It's basically gives you your genomic profile, supposedly, but it doesn't really. You can buy it on Amazon.com, and just to give you an idea. It's you know, it's not expensive. It's like $65 or $70 now. They've radically reduced. Are people just, some of you know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, good. You know, they've radically reduced the price of this, and it's supposed to, you know, give you a sense of, you know, what you're going to die of. Like, who wants to know that? Okay? You know, so, but I mean, of course it doesn't. It's totally inaccurate. As are actually, I mean, those of you who know anything about the scientific debates around this stuff, even the ones that cost $800, you know, are wildly inaccurate because of the way they're interpreted, really. But I'm not going to go into that now. But in any case, so, you know, that's sort of the world in terms of also the sense of control that we could potentially have if we knew in advance what we were prone to become, right? I mean, old, decrepit. Yeah, we're all going to become old and decrepit, but I mean worse than that somehow. So, here I think we can see the way in which this means-ends thinking that Arendt always criticized tends to creep into our thinking whenever we're faced with these kinds of issues, and how the logic of utility really rules our thinking when confronted with what appear to be straightforward issues of human welfare. So just very briefly, because this is a huge debate, as you will also know, the debate over GMO foods, right? You've got some leftists and feminists and environmentalists lined up against other leftists and feminists and environmentalists, accusing the other side of disguised, you know, first worldism, bourgeois privilege, and so on. And the problem in a lot of these debates is not only that the science on either side is either ignored or dismissed. I mean, I don't want to fetishize science here, but I still think there's a place for science, unlike our president. But they tend to take place in a register of ethics rather than politics. And notwithstanding the genuinely complex accounts of ethical thinking in the work of many 20th century philosophers, including Foucault, these discussions tend to be had at a level of what would be the right or the wrong thing to do. I mean, that's why a lot of, where I think Arendt can help us here is to try to figure out, well, what does it mean to really think about these issues politically, but not in a register or a logic of utility, or a means-ends logic, right? Because, I mean, to the extent that they're not thought about in terms of ethics and they're thought about in terms of politics, then it's a question of means-ends thinking, right? I mean, how can we achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, utilitarian thinking, or whatever it may be. But what would actually be an Arendtian approach to something like GMO foods? I mean, how would that be different from what's out there right now that passes for a political explanation? So there was, those of you who know me or know me for a while will know that there was a time in my academic career when I really thought that these were the important points to make over and over in my many attempts to defend Arendt against her many critics. I still do, though, you know, these enemy critics, though not defeated, or fortunately faded somewhat in my mind. But the reality is that these points about the importance of a non-means ends or instrumentalist conception of politics, or what it would actually mean to think about freedom in non-sovereign terms. All these things that are just sort of familiar to anyone who reads Arendt are actually incredibly difficult. Let me back up. They're easier to defend when you're standing up here giving this kind of lecture, or you're talking to a group of Habermasians or whatever who have read her in a certain way, you want to read her in a different way. But they're difficult actually to defend in everyday political life, right? Because as Drusilla said earlier, in our political lives, we want to win, you know? And it's important to think, or to remember at least, that Arendt does not deny the importance of, or not the importance, well, yeah, in a way the importance, but the simple fact, let's just put it that way, that people go into politics for very instrumental reasons. That's why they go into politics, because they want to get something done. She doesn't actually criticize that. What she criticizes is our understanding of that being the totality of what politics is. Right? In other words, that yes, that's why we go into politics. But at the end of the day, the reason that we stay in politics cannot just be all the causes we win. Because as a rule, we're going to lose a lot more than we win. It has actually to do with exactly this kind of world-building capacity of politics, as she describes it, or the construction of this in between that can, you know, sort of help you get up again in the morning, presumably. And that's, you know, my sort of small solace here, but that's it. Thank you. Yes.
So if I'm following part of what you're saying, I want you to talk more about it.
Sure.
And it's, you know, Arendt talks a lot about how can we escape tyrannical thinking, which is this instrumentalist logic, this utilitarian means and thinking process that we fall into. And you connected that, those logical trains of thought that we form and adopt, and you connected that to one of the possibilities why she's dismissive of the body because it relates to necessity. And necessity is a kind of means ends realm in a certain sense. And then you connected it back later in the talk and raised this question of, well, what would an Arendtian approach to GMO food look like? Or what would let's say, what would an Arendtian approach to birth control look like? How would we have this non-tyrannical, self-reflective reasoning? And that just seems like such an important question right now in our political environment. So I was wondering if you have a response to that. Can you push it further?
That's why I put it as a question. I mean it genuinely as a question. I think what becomes, thank you, I mean, you know, what becomes clearer and clearer to me is that the way these discussions have been parsed is either you've got sort of the ethicists on the one side, right? For example, end-of-life decisions. You know, do you have the right to commit doctor-assisted suicide, et cetera? These are all discussed then by, you know, like the ethical, like the people who are going to develop the ethics of medicine. And then as a rule, that's not Levinasian, okay? I mean, that's, you know, it's all sort of really the old form of morality. Like, we are going to come up with a sort of a right and a wrong, at least a kind of code that you can it might not be precise, but it's basically going to be something you can, all doctors will learn it, and patients will be handed whatever, the small print. And on the other side, you have people who want to discuss things politically, and not just in these moral terms, but then those terms tend to be inevitably these instrumentalist terms, So, I mean, I'm not even gonna say I hate. I'm happy to come back to, I don't know, those of you who've read Feyerabend's work, for example. Paul Feyerabend, I mean, he was a firebrand for so many reasons, and unfortunately, he got accused of relativism. That was the big, he was a student of Popper's, he revolted against Popper, he revolted against pretty much everything, every person he learned anything from. But the main thing that I think he contributed that's relevant for our discussion here is this whole idea of what does it mean to talk about science in a democratic society, right? And he was just completely opposed to the scientific discussion of science. Like, only scientists can discuss science. And that's what, of course, we've done. And from an Arendtian standpoint, that's exactly the problem. I mean, it's this idea of, we've got a problem, okay, and we need somebody to fix it, and so who's best to fix it? The experts. Those are going to be the scientists, and so, I mean, you folks know all of this already. But that is the kind of discussion I think she's really pressing us to insist upon. But I also recommend going back to people like Feyerabend, because they were really concerned. There was a huge debate. In a way, there still is a debate about what it means to talk about science in a free and democratic society, and that non-specialists. Well, I mean, all the debate around AIDS, for example, I mean, initially, right? I mean, it was all about, oh no, only the scientists, could be in on this discussion. And, queer activists were just, no way, right? I mean, we're going to get in on this discussion. We have something to say here, etc. And learned a lot, but they didn't become scientists. So that's, kind of. Just one quick qualification is that the trick with reading Arendt, besides not thinking of her as an analytic philosopher, I know people in this room don't, but I think a lot of other people kind of do, is that you don't know, is this Arendt speaking, or who's speaking, right? I mean, and this is my problem with introducing Arendt, introducing students to Arendt through the human condition, which I am never doing again, okay? You introduce them through the political writings, and maybe like an essay, like What is Freedom, something, a little lighter. I mean, because if you go into the, really, it's a very phenomenological text in so many ways, and it can give you the impression, all the things, and then you spend the rest of your time trying to persuade them, oh no, she didn't really mean these things are all absolutely separate. So that's for those of you, who are going to become professors or teachers or whatever, do not start with the human condition. Yeah, Morris.
I agree. Do not start with the human condition. But even in the human condition, there's a place that's on the thing I prepared on the back where she talks about the way in which, and this relates to the question of politicization and to the overcoming the means-ends instrumental approach. She talks about the 19th century, the labor movement in the 19th century. And what she says is, of course, it started out as an interest group interested in changing the conditions of work and so on. But she says they wrote the most glorious chapter in the history. Why? Because in the course of pushing interest group politics, they discovered that they had to think about different ways she talks about, of government. And that in the form of workers' councils, a new imagination of political possibility came into existence. And I think if we look for analogies, you just gave us a great one. Because in trying to think the history of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender movement in recent decades, clearly one of the turning points was the AIDS epidemic. And what happened
Absolutely.
there, in response to a life or death series of crises that was afflicting people we knew, and where
the government wasn't
you
doing
had to
anything.
deal with but you had to deal with doctors, you had to deal with government, and in the course of pressing the interest of the sick and dying, something new happened.
Exactly.
I mean, the role of lesbians in ACT UP and even in gay men's health crisis is an important thing. Alliances were formed, and it was more than anybody anticipated. And this is the lost treasure of revolution.
Yes, so but people also discovered, I think you bring up a really good point, which is, people also discovered that they have political competencies that they didn't know they had, right? And, so what's the thing? Well, the feminist groups that were built on consensus, which everybody, kind of, some people made fun of, others said, oh, we got to get rid of that because we're not going to get anything done here if we have to bring everybody around. But the whole idea was that you weren't, it didn't just become, the goal in a way was the debate. The goal was trying to persuade people. It wasn't just like, what is the thing you want to actually achieve? So all of these forms of developing, and there were people who criticized this, like Joe Freeman, wrote this essay, Tyranny of Structurelessness, that, well, we need to have, more structure. You get the people who are very powerful talking all the time and all that. Yes, but the point is that people discover that they have precisely the political competencies that the people in power are telling them they don't have, So they're just acting like, as I have a graduate student who wrote a dissertation on this through Rancière, basically as if they have these competencies. And then guess what? They have them, just through the practice of, doing these things. Drusilla?
Yeah, this is a question about the relationship. I think it relates to what you were saying, Sam, about the role of motivation to enter politics. And its relationship to the ethical. Something that at least I have not found Arendt often speaking to, which is, why do people stay in politics? I suppose that's been always my lifelong attraction to Kant. Kant once said, if justice disappears, it's no longer worthwhile for human beings to walk upon this earth, and justice can always disappear. And so the connection between being a certain kind of human being, an ethical human being, is certainly what's kept me in politics. Those photographs that Hannah Arendt saw black parents failing at, I saw white monstrosity. But I felt that as a white person, if I didn't fight racism, I had no prayer of being a good human being. And so the question of being a good human being and then framing ideals, even as aesthetic ideas, which can always be challenged, ideals about what it means to be a good human being, sort of became the heart of my project. So I call it ethical feminism, not political feminism. And I think a lot of what the contest in feminism has always been about the failure to articulate and to debate out what it means to be an ethical human being, including an ethical feminist. And that has oftentimes led to debates that go nowhere. You're way too young to remember this, but I was present in the conference on Simone de Beauvoir when Audre Lorde called everybody in the room a racist. And the response was extreme defensiveness, and she was 100% right. That the whole way, everything from reproduction to what it means to have a body, everything is racialized in this society. And Audre Lorde pointed that out. And the response was that she's a woman like every other woman. Well, she's not. So I got up and walked out with a black woman. And I didn't do it because of politics. I did it because I thought that was the only right thing to do. And so much of feminism to me in these political battles has just been defensive, including over the debate over pornography. So I was serious when I said, what was my solution? All these women were screaming at each other. It was to go find a woman who was really doing the hard work on the ground to make things different in the pornography industry. Why weren't we on her picket lines? Why were we screaming at each other? And I always took it because they wasn't asking the question, the First Amendment people and the Catherine McKenna people. What does it mean to be a good person? Because if you were thinking that question, you'd think somebody is doing this work and making a difference in the pornography industry. And I was told there is no union. But there was a union. So I'm really interested in your response to how Arendt thinks about political motivation through the ethical and through this endless redrawing of what it means to be a good person as what keeps you in the political struggle.
Okay. Can I invite other people to get in on this, Eva?
Yeah, might be related, might not be related. I really think that what you put on the table, the process of politicization, is important, very important, because it does not, of course, happen. It requires alliances and action, etc. So politicization presupposes engagement and action and alliances in the first place to say the household work is political, sexual harassment is political. It will not take one person to do that, nor just intellectual debate. It also requires alliances and maybe it is in the context of the alliances that the ethical question arises. Again, I never thought about it because it seems to me that what always exceeds the instrumental question of politics, how to do something effectively, etc., is what kind of relations are established in the process of fighting for it. You know what I mean? Arendt always is talking about the web of relations and the kind of relations that are being established through acting in concert, and on Revolution says people who are unfreedom, unequal, etc., became so through the act. It was the act that, so there's something in that relationality itself that reenacted, even if for a moment, the possibility of freedom and equality through action. And we can imagine many alliances, we don't have to imagine, we know them, that are driven for good aims, but are entirely harmful, dictatorial, etc., right? So the question of alliance is an important one to think through, maybe where the question of politicization and the question of ethics somehow come together.
Yeah, I guess, this is sort of more a response to Drusilla's question. I think what you're doing is great. It's just, I'm always trying to, just like I'm always trying to pull Arendt away from the philosophers, I'm also always trying to pull her away from the people who want to talk about ethics, because I think she's one of the few thinkers who really is rigorously political. And what I mean by that is, the other being maybe Machiavellic. She's so insistent that what connects us is the world we have in common. In other words, it's the world as a shared object, not the self, not the subject, not being a good person or not being a good person. She doesn't deny that those are important questions and things that each person has to work out for him or herself. But the point is really, as she says, and I think it's in the lectures on Kant, where she's actually talking about Kant, and she says, that Kant's claim that, basically you could, how can I put it exactly, you could sort of save a race of devils. They could be a race of devils if only they had the right constitution. So in other words, they could all be really bad people, But if you have the right constitution that creates, through which they create then, or which regulates, if you say in the loose sense, their public relations with each other, then it'll be okay. So Kant too, even though yes, he was of course interested in morals, as we all well know, nevertheless what Arendt liked in Kant was precisely not the second critique, as you know, but the third critique, and specifically though the fact that Kant had this insight into the importance of a shared world as our common object, and not certain kinds of moral ideals. And here, you know, I mean, she just is following Machiavelli, because that's Machiavelli's teaching as well, right? Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, just to add to that, because I think your response about her politicalness is right, and I think very important. But I'm sure you know this, there's one instance, she says over and over, where ethics becomes political in a time of emergency, in a time when the common world has sort of gone off the deep end. And she points to ethical figures, primarily Socrates and Karl Jaspers, as people who, simply by being good people, became political, right? And in their goodness, they became political actors because they stood for the proposition that I cannot do what other people are doing. I cannot participate in segregation or some sort of mob rule on somebody else. And simply in that act of refusal, they become, in an ethical act, they become political actors. I mean, is that one way to...
But she would, yes, okay, I mean, that's fine. But I mean, in those moments, right, when, as she puts it, the chips are down, it is a matter of a capacity for judgment, right? Capacity specifically for reflective judgment. Not whether you're a good person. I mean, I don't know, I just, like for me, these terms...
Jaspers, he's someone who simply, you knew he was simply someone who couldn't do that.
Granted, it's not that she doesn't say those things, but what I'm saying is that her thought is fundamentally, radically political. It is not ethical.
I agree.
She doesn't want to base the creation and maintenance of the common world on our capacity to be good people.
Well,
like it's really a matter, it's like if we're good people, that's great. But if we even are going to become good people, as she says very clearly in the, you know, what do you call it, Introduction to Politics, into politics, you know, it's a matter of really focusing on the world that we have in common, that we build in common. Lori?
I don't want to interrupt you, I just...
No, are you in this,
Yes.
like this tune? Okay. Please.
Okay.
No.
I mean, I guess that, so I just want to return to that by way of those comments. I want to think about, I'm still having trouble with this idea, like, if you want to think with Arendt against Arendt, like, why are you so reluctant? Why do you start by saying, is the private political or is the personal political, or whatever, and you say no, and you find the body to be with Arendt, and you want to not read Arendt as an analytical philosopher, but with Arendt you're still willing, I think, to say that the body is the realm of means and ends. And it's the realm of necessity, and hence it can't really be political, it can only be politicized. And yes, we must look at how it's politicized, but you're saying it can't be political in and of itself, because politics is an activity. I think
Right.
I've got you right.
Yeah, no, I would say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but I guess I'm just still troubled by that a little bit, because if we think, oh, how do we think, why is the realm of the body the realm of means, ends, and necessity? I mean, even in your example about new technologies and feminists, wanting to renaturalize the body in relationship to the horrors of the possibility of new technology. For example, we can both think of plenty of feminists who don't want to do that, like Shulamit Firestone or
Right.
Donna Haraway, and
Right.
who are thinking very much outside the realm of means and ends, but looking at the body as the site of politics, as a site that is about collective action, that is about unpredictability, about alliances, the possibility of change, all that stuff.
But I don't disagree with that.
Well,
Okay,
then-
so then maybe I shouldn't have agreed with your first version of
Okay.
me. Because I'm not saying the body is anything, okay? And I'm not saying that Arendt is saying that either. What I am insisting upon, and I will insist upon this until they put me in the ground, well, I'm not going in the ground getting cremated, but I mean, it's like, is that, you know, there is no political substance. I mean, there's nothing in anything that makes it political.
Right.
What makes something political, which is the Arendtian, that's the radical part of Arendt that lends itself to feminism, is anything can in principle
Yes.
become an object of common concern. So, you know, where's the problem? She's not saying the body by definition, and this is what I meant when I said how you read, who's speaking here. She's talking about the Greeks and how the Greeks saw the body and how they saw, that's her account in the human condition, which is why I don't want to start with the human condition. But
I agree, but then what about this relationship between subordination and oppression? I mean, if we see subordination and oppression is something that is political and thus open to change, your definition, what makes oppression political and thus open to change is when we see subordination under the lens of capitalism as exploitation and alienation, or under the lens of racism as white supremacy, or under the lens of feminism as patriarchy.
Right.
So it is that activity that moves it from one realm to the other. So the body is like everything else like that. Correct? Is that right? So
Well-
then how is, okay.
yeah, no, all I'm saying, I mean, I don't know, I'm probably not being
I'm just trying to
clear.
clarify.
Yeah, no, I mean, all I'm saying is that we shouldn't think about the body, reproduction, housework, anything as being intrinsically political. It can potentially be politicized, but politics for Arendt is not really a noun. It's really a verb, okay? It's an activity. And so the problem, I think, and I think this is a huge problem, and let me just say, for those of you who love Foucault, I really like Foucault too, but the fact is that, you know, there's like this Foucauldian hangover where people, and it's not just Foucault, it's a way in which our understanding of power, and even though Arendt's conception is very idiosyncratic, I grant that, right, you know, no problem. But our tendency is to think power's everywhere. And power is a synonym for politics. So all these things where there's power, there's politics. It's political. It's all political. Now, as a matter of ordinary speech, fine. I'm not going to go around correcting people. They can listen to me anyway. But it's well, Hannah Arendt says no. I mean, that's a very specific use of politics. But what bothers me is then when it gets, you know, sort of taken into feminist thought such that we lose track of how it is that we feminists made these things political, or any radical group made something political. That's this predicative moment of politics. You know, that's the moment when you actually name something for what it is. Now, in Leclos and Mouffe's case, it's the same thing. They're just saying, yeah, subordination, relations of power, yeah, they're everywhere. You know, but that doesn't mean they're political in the Arendtian sense. They're only political when they're named as relations of oppression, which is to say they're relations that can be changed. That's all. That's really all I'm saying. I mean, so I don't know, maybe I'm being too generous to her there. I don't know. But maybe that's reading Arendt against Arendt. Drusilla?
Yeah, I want to push you more.
Yeah.
I'm very aware of the Kant once said, if we were a race of devils, we still might get to a constitution. But we have the 20th century behind us, and one of the big questions that Foucault said, this is a Foucault that has been lost in the United States, is the only really important question is the question of revolution. Now when you ask why did these revolutions fail, you're stuck, I believe, with what Patrick Henry says, the horizontal aspect of the revolution. He was in a revolutionary government in Antigua, which is a horizontal revolution, the economic transformation, but you're also stuck with another question, the vertical revolution. What kind of person is it that could truly live in an egalitarian society, much more egalitarian than any society that can possibly be imagined under capitalism? And so if you have ideals that get you into politics, and you connect those ideals with what it means to be a human being. This is Frantz Fanon, by the way, who Arendt doesn't understand at all. Because Fanon was all about creating the kind of human being who could have a shared world. Because in a colonized world under imperialism, thoroughly racialized, there's no shared world. I mean, my daughter has a black boyfriend. Boy, do I know that his world and my world have nothing in common. I mean, even though we struggle to talk to each other. And I think that was Fanon's point. Unless we have ideals of humanity that guide us, all we will do is, and this is Henry's point, is replicate domination. I would add domination to our oppression, subordination. And that world will not be in common. There will not be generality. Because in order to have generality, you have to have some kind of shared notion of what you are fighting for. And that it's the ideal and ethical ideals that actually limit the instrumentality of politics. Because and so Lenin just had it wrong. The ends don't justify the means at all. That fails. So you have to ask the question of what kind of human being can actually live in a constant struggle for a more just world. Even if you see it as a constant struggle, there has to be some ethical limits on it. And I have never particularly been attracted to Hannah Arendt because I don't see her actually engaging that question.
You're right. I mean, I think that's right. But let me try to point out some of the shared ground before I say what I think we're still differing on. I mean, the shared ground is that I fully agree with you that, let's take feminism now, that feminism does have to talk about ideals, and it does have to talk about possible futures. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think this idea that we can have some kind of non-normative critical theory is beyond absurd. Okay, first of all, non esiste, all right? And secondly, it shouldn't exist because, it's just, you need ideals to motivate people. The question is, though, how are those ideals, how do they become part of flesh and blood? You know what I mean? I mean, how do they become more than just slogans of one form or another? And so to take your example, how do you become a, quote, good person in the terms that you would define it? Well, I think you become a good person by engaging in certain kinds of political activities. That's how you become a good person. Otherwise, you have to say some people are born good people, or they're not born good people, or they sit in their room when they're 5 years old and decide I'm going to be a good person or I'm not going to be a good person. But we all know that's not the way it happens. It's through environmental shaping. It's through participating in choosing to go and participate in activities that scare you, for example. Putting yourself in a room with groups of people who really don't like you, okay, because you represent a form of power that they're fighting against, or whatever it is, or being willing to voice opinions even at the risk of, being shut down immediately as not knowing the experience of X. I mean, these are all things, that's how you become a good person in my view. I wouldn't call it a good person as such, but I don't have a problem if you want to use that language. It's just for me that involves a set of political practices, which also have an ethical component. I don't deny that. All I'm saying is that, what is all I'm saying? Okay, so all I'm saying is that I feel like democratic theory today and feminist theory has moved way, way, way too much in the direction of ethics and just muddled the distinction between ethics and politics, and also ethics and morals, frankly, such that, you know, is that a properly ethical question? I mean, once again, I'm not building boundaries here any more than I think Arendt is. But I do think that there are differences of whether we're thinking at a political register or an ethical register. And that there are certain, I'm going to get to you in a second, there are certain things in human life where the ethical register is absolutely the one we should be thinking in. And not the political one, but vice versa. So, yeah.
Did we want to transition this into the?
Oh, yeah, no, obviously, yeah, I gotta stop.
I don't
Okay.
want to interrupt.
No, let's just get Dawn's question and then.
You anticipated my point a little bit, which was to say that sometimes that might be done in more private situations and, be more properly ethical, and sometimes it might be done in political situations, right? So I was just going to ask if there's room to allow that both of those processes are important, but also, and this is the proposition I want to make, that those practices might strengthen each other, right? That the kinds of political courage that one needs to be able to do those things in public actually begins with being able to put our intimate relationships at risk by doing them in private. Mm-hmm. It's maybe like a way around the tension.
We're just gonna leave it at that, because I agree. Thank you.